In July 1518, a woman named Anya Trofea stepped into a Strasbourg street and began to dance. There was no music, no celebration, just violent, convulsive movements that wouldn't stop. Within days, hundreds joined her, dancing themselves to death. For 5 centuries, science blamed a fungus. But what if the real plague wasn't in their bread? What if it was in their souls? And what if the cure prescribed by their own physicians was actually the thing that killed them? The heat of July 1518 was a physical presence in the city of Strasbourg. It was a thick, suffocating blanket, woven from the stink of open sewers, unwashed bodies, and the cloying sweetness of rot. It clung to the narrow, timber-framed houses that leaned into each other over the cobblestone streets, trapping the air and baking the filth that lay in the gutters. This was a summer of despair. The harvest had failed, the spectre of famine loomed, and the whispers of God's displeasure were a constant, corrosive murmur. Into this oppressive silence stepped a woman. Her name was Anya Trofea. She was not a person of note, just one of the countless faces etched with the hardships of the era. Her face was gaunt, her eyes holding a haunted, vacant quality, as if she were looking at something far beyond the squalid street. She walked to the center of the lane, her bare feet finding purchase on the hot, uneven stones, and she began to dance. There was no music, no joyful festival, no drunken revelry. Her movements were a violent argument with the air. Her limbs jerked, her torso convulsed. It was the horrifying marionette dance of a body whose strings had been seized by an unseen puppeteer. One arm flung out, rigid, while her head snapped to the side. Her legs stomped and shuffled in a parody of a peasant jig, but there was no joy in it, only a relentless, mechanical compulsion. A few of her neighbors, listless in the heat, turned to watch. A woman shaking out a dusty rug from a window above, a cooper leaning against a barrel, a pair of children chasing a rat near a drainage ditch. Their initial expressions were of idle curiosity, perhaps thinking Frau Trofea had finally succumbed to the heat madness that often flickered at the edges of such a summer. But as the minutes stretched on, bemusement curdled into a deep and profound unease. Her dance did not stop. It continued with the same frantic, disjointed energy, a physical monologue of silent screaming. The only sound was the rhythmic, slapping punctuation of her feet on the cobblestones and the ragged, percussive gasps of her own breathing. She was a single, discordant note in the city-esque grim symphony, a human engine locked into a cycle of meaningless motion. The crowd grew, a silent, fearful ring of onlookers. They saw the sweat plastering her thin hair to her skull, the wild, unseeing look in her eyes, the sheer impossibility of her endurance. They were witnessing the birth of a plague, but they had no name for it yet. They were watching the first tremor of an earthquake that would shatter their understanding of the world. 5 centuries later, the world was a place of quiet, sterile order. In a laboratory bathed in the cool, blue-white glow of monitors, Dr. Julien Dubois commanded plagues with the click of a mouse. His world was the antithesis of that 16th century street. Here, the air was filtered, the temperature controlled, the only smell that of clean electronics and strong black coffee. Julien was a man who found sanctuary in data. He was an epidemiologist, but his true passion was history's ghosts. He hunted the spectral signatures of long-dead pathogens, taming ancient chaos with modern mathematics. On the massive screen before him, the Black Death raged across a map of 14th century Europe. It was a storm of crimson and black, a digital inferno. But for Julien, it was a problem to be solved, a set of variables to be isolated. With a few precise economical movements, he manipulated the model. He factored in trade routes, population density, the estimated incubation period of Yersinia pestis. The storm subsided, the patterns emerged, the chaos resolved into clean, elegant lines of transmission. He took a sip of his coffee, his eyes never leaving the screen. He saw the past not as a collection of stories, but as a trove of data points waiting for the right algorithm to unlock their secrets. He found comfort in the quantifiable, the evidence-based, the cold, hard certainty of a pathogen that could be identified, sequenced, and understood. Superstition, faith, fear. These were confounding variables, human noise that clouded the purity of the data. His job was to filter that noise, to find the biological signal beneath the bedlam of history. A man like Julien did not believe in curses or divine wrath. He believed in bacteria, in viruses, in mycotoxins and prions. He believed that every mystery, no matter how terrifying or bizarre, was simply a question that hadn't been asked in the right scientific language. He was a fortress of reason, and his walls were built from empirical evidence. His focus was absolute, a state of intellectual grace he cultivated. It was broken by the quiet, insistent chime of a video call notification. He glanced at the corner of his screen, a flicker of annoyance crossing his sharp features. An unscheduled call, an interruption. He sighed, a small puff of irritation, and accepted the call. The face of Anya Fogel materialized on his screen. She was a woman in her 40s, with warm, intelligent eyes magnified by the glasses perched on her nose. Her background was a world away from his sterile lab. It was an embrace of warm wood and the spines of countless leather-bound books. She was an archivist in Strasbourg, a digital acquaintance he'd consulted on a previous paper. "Dr. Dubois," she began, her voice crackling with an energy that was entirely alien to his quiet lab. "Julien, I apologize for the intrusion, but something has come up. Something I think you will want to see." Julien leaned back, his expression guarded. "Anya, it is fine. What is it?" "We've been digitizing the old parish tax records from the early 16th century. Dry as dust, mostly. But we had to move some of the original crates, and one of them had a false bottom. Inside," she paused for dramatic effect, "was this." She held a small, leather-bound book up to the camera. It was ancient, the cover warped and stained, held shut by a simple leather tie. "It's a diary, the personal diary of a physician S assistant named Thomas. And Julien, he was there. He witnessed the dancing plague of 1518 from the very beginning." Julien sat forward. His professional curiosity, a creature that was never truly asleep, began to stir. The dancing plague. It was a famous case, a historical curiosity. The official theory was ergotism, a toxic fungus on rye bread causing convulsions. It was a neat, if not entirely satisfying, explanation. "His notes have never been studied, Doctor," Anya continued, her excitement palpable. "They've been hidden for 500 years. He writes about the first dancer, the spread. He describes the symptoms in incredible detail." She leaned closer to her camera, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "And he claims the official diagnosis, the one prescribed by the city's ruling physicians, was a catastrophic failure. His words, he says their cure only made it worse. We thought of you. We thought you might be the person to finally find out what truly happened." The word catastrophic hung in the air between them. It was a hook. A clean, simple case of mycotoxicology was one thing. A historical medical cover-up, a 500-year-old mystery rooted in a fatal diagnostic error, was another thing entirely. Julien looked from Anya's eager face to the ancient diary she held, a vessel containing a lost first-hand account of a world gone mad. The fortress of his reason had a gate, and it was swinging open. The clean, orderly data of his Black Death model suddenly seemed pale and lifeless compared to the raw, chaotic, and utterly compelling mystery contained in that little book. The flight from Paris to Strasbourg was a brief, sterile jump between two worlds. For Dr. Julien Dubois, it was merely a commute, a necessary inconvenience to get to the data. But as he stepped from the modern air-conditioned airport into the Alsatian city, the past began to assert itself. The historic centre of Strasbourg was a living museum, its cathedral spire piercing the sky, its half-timbered houses leaning over ancient canals. It was beautiful, but to Julien, it was primarily a source of context. the environment in which his specimen, the diary, had been created. The municipal archives were housed in a grand, imposing stone building that smelled of old paper, floor wax, and the quiet reverence of accumulated knowledge. Anja Vogel met him in the lobby, and her warm, in-person greeting was a pleasant match to her video call persona. She led him through hushed corridors, her sensible shoes clicking softly on the polished floors, to a private research room. There, on a cushion of inert grey foam, sat the diary. It was smaller than he'd imagined, a deeply personal object that felt almost alive in the sterile environment. The leather was dark with age, the tie frail. "Here it is," Anja said, her voice a near whisper. 500 years of silence. Julien nodded, his eyes fixed on the artifact. This was it, the primary source. "Thank you for facilitating this, Anja. I won't be long." As he reached for his archival gloves, Anja hesitated. "The locals, you know," she began, a little shyly. "The old stories say it was Saint Vitus. They say the people of Strasbourg had grown impious, and the saints sent the dancing fever to punish them. A curse." Julien paused, offering a polite, practiced, and utterly dismissive smile. It was the smile he reserved for well-meaning people who spoke of ghosts and omens. "Thank you, Ms. Vogel. I appreciate the context, but I prefer to stick to the evidence." He carefully untied the leather strap, his fingers gentle on the fragile artifact. Curses don't leave biomarkers. The days that followed dissolved into a single-minded obsession. For Julien, the archive room became his entire world. The long table was a battlefield where he marshaled the forces of modern science against the chaos of the past. On one side lay the diary, its pages brittle as autumn leaves. On the other, his laptop glowed, a portal to 5 centuries of accumulated medical knowledge. He worked with a monk-like devotion, wearing soft cotton gloves as he turned each fragile page. The old German script was a dense thicket of unfamiliar characters and archaic phrasing. But slowly, painstakingly, Julien began to clear a path. He photographed each page, running the images through translation software, then cross-referencing the machine's clumsy output with his own knowledge of historical linguistics and his growing familiarity with the author's unique handwriting. And then he found it, the signal in the noise. The diarist, Thomas, had a keen eye for clinical detail. He described the initial symptoms with a precision that made Julien's pulse quicken. "They complain of a fire in the mind," Thomas wrote, "and a crawling sensation under the skin, as if 1,000 ants march upon them." Julien's fingers flew across his keyboard. He pulled up medical journals, textbooks on toxicology. The words on his screen seemed to leap out in confirmation. Formication, the tactile hallucination of insects crawling on or under the skin. A classic symptom. The diary continued. "Their limbs are seized by a will not their own, muscles knotted and rigid before they are thrown into the frantic motion of the dance." Convulsive ergotism, Julien thought, the name of the diagnosis forming in his mind like a crystal. Poisoning from the fungus Claviceps purpurea, a common blight on rye crops. In a time of famine, the poor would have eaten contaminated grain without a second thought. It explained the muscle spasms, the convulsions. The visions of fire in the mind were the hallucinations, the LSD-like effects of the ergot alkaloids. It all fit. It was perfect. A surge of triumphant confidence washed over him. He had been here less than a week, and he had already cracked a 500-year-old case. The mystery was unfolding exactly as it should, yielding its secrets to the relentless application of the scientific method. There was no curse. There was only a fungus, a contaminated food supply, and a predictable physiological response. As he translated a passage describing the second week of the plague, the sterile words on the page conjured a vivid, horrifying vision. The scene shifted, the quiet archive dissolving into the sun-scorched bedlam of a 1518 street. The lone figure of Anja Trofea was gone, swallowed by a crowd. Dozens, perhaps more than 100 people, now filled the market square. They were a writhing, heaving mass of bodies, their limbs flailing in a grotesque parody of dance. But the most unsettling part was not the number, but the synchrony. It wasn't the chaotic, individual twitching of poisoning. Their movements, while frantic, were beginning to align. Heads snapped to the left in near unison. A wave of stomping feet traveled through the crowd like a shockwave. They were a single organism, a human hive moving to the beat of a phantom rhythm that only they could hear. An oppressive sense of profound wrongness hung over the scene. Healthy citizens backed away, their faces masks of terror, their hands instinctively making the sign of the cross. Even the city guards, men armed with steel and authority, stood frozen, their weapons useless against a plague that made people dance. They were helpless, and they were afraid. Back in the silent archive, Julien shook his head slightly, as if to clear the image. A strange detail. Synchronization. He filed it away as an anomaly, a flourish of the direst frightened imagination. He turned the page, eager to find the passages that would cement his theory. He found something else entirely. He found the account of the official response. His eyes scanned the lines of spidery script, his initial confidence slowly chilling into disbelief, and then into horror. Thomas, the diarist, wrote of a tense meeting of the city council and the guilds. He had been there as an assistant to his master. He described the esteemed Meister Klaus Richter, head of the Physicians' Guild, a man whose pronouncements carried the weight of absolute law. Richter, a figure of immense authority with a beard that seemed woven from pure conviction, had examined the afflicted. He had dismissed the talk of curses as peasant superstition. He was a man of science, 16th century science. "The affliction is clear," Richter had declared, his voice booming with unshakable certainty. "It is a case of hot blood. Their humors are unbalanced, their blood naturally overheated by the summer sun. It is a fever of the body that seeks to express itself through motion." Julien stopped reading, his own blood running cold. Hot blood. A humoral theory, a relic of Galenic medicine, utterly baseless. He forced himself to continue. The diary detailed Richter's prescribed cure. If the hot blood needed to escape through motion, then the cure was simple. The afflicted must be encouraged to dance. They had to dance the fever out of their systems until their humors were rebalanced. The final sentences of the passage were written in a hand that shook with rage and despair. Thomas described how, on the council's orders, the city's guilds began constructing a large wooden stage in the grain market. Carpenters were hired, musicians were summoned, their lutes and pipes ordered to play ceaselessly, to drive the dancers on, to encourage the fever to burn itself out. Julien stared at the page, the words blurring. He saw it with perfect, sickening clarity. The stage, the manic musicians, the exhausted, dying citizens being driven to move, their tortured bodies forced into one final fatal performance. He leaned back in his chair, a pale, sickened look on his face. He whispered the words into the silence of the archive, a horrified eulogy across 5 centuries. "They are not curing them," he breathed. "They are killing them." The discovery that the city's physicians had actively engineered the deaths of their citizens left Julien in a state of cold, professional rage. But as night fell and he retreated to the solitude of his hotel room, that rage began to curdle into something far more unsettling: intellectual doubt. The sheer stupidity of the hot blood diagnosis had blinded him to the growing flaws in his own theory. Now, in the quiet of the room, those flaws were screaming at him. His hotel room had transformed into an investigation hub, a chaotic web of history and data. A large corkboard leaned against one wall, a 16th century map of Strasbourg pinned to its center. For hours, he had been meticulously placing red pins into the map, each one marking the home of an afflicted person as noted in the diary of Thomas. It was a practice he'd used a dozen times before, a way to visualize the spread of a pathogen, to trace it back to its source, a contaminated well, a tainted granary, a single infected traveler. But the map of Strasbourg refused to cooperate. He stared at the constellation of red pins, a muscle twitching in his jaw. It made no sense. A foodborne contaminant like ergot on rye should radiate from a source. It should cluster around a baker, a mill, or affect entire households who shared the same bread. The red pins did none of that. They were scattered, almost maliciously random. A single house on one street, then 3 houses on a lane across the market square, while all the homes in between remained untouched. It was as if the plague could jump over walls. He turned to his laptop, his last bastion of order. He had built a simple transmission model, feeding it the locations from the map and the parameters of a foodborne illness. He ran the simulation. The result was a statistical nightmare. The program flashed a warning: probability of fit 0.001. The observed pattern was virtually impossible for a contaminant spreading from a central source. He leaned back, the air leaving his lungs in a frustrated hiss. The pins on the map weren't tracing a pathogen. They were tracing something else, something that spread not through bread, but perhaps by line of sight. The ergotism theory, once so elegant and satisfying, was beginning to fray. The clean scientific explanation was tearing at the seams, and Julien was staring into the void of the unknown. He found the confirmation of his fears in a short, brutal entry from the diary, S. 3rd week. Thomas wrote of a family he knew, the Schmidts, who lived near the Tanners district. Julien closed his eyes, and the words on the page bloomed into a vivid, waking nightmare. The Schmidt family is huddled inside their cramped, dark home. It is a single room, smelling of wood smoke and boiled cabbage. Outside, the phantom music and the endless rhythmic stomping of the dancers form a constant, oppressive backdrop. The father, a burly man with calloused hands, watches his teenage daughter, Elisa. An hour ago, they had all shared the same meal: a small loaf of dark rye bread and some weak cheese. Now, as she sits mending a tunic, Elisa S. hands slow, then stop. Her needle falls from her fingers. Her father calls her name. Elisa, she doesn't respond. Her eyes, fixed on the wall, glaze over with a terrifying emptiness. Slowly, as if in a trance, she stands up. She moves toward the door, not with the jerky convulsions of the first dancers, but with the fluid, somnambulistic grace of a sleepwalker. Her family, her father, mother, and 2 younger brothers, all of whom ate the exact same bread, from the exact same loaf, can only watch, paralyzed with a horror that is beyond comprehension. She opens the door, steps out into the street, and without a moment's hesitation, joins the frantic, writhing sea of dancers, instantly swallowed by the madness. The door swings shut, leaving her family in the sudden, terrible silence of their home. The next day, Julien met Anya for coffee at a small cafe near the archives. He looked tired, his usual sharp intensity blunted by exhaustion and frustration. He hadn't slept. The image of Elisa Schmidt leaving her family had played on a loop in his mind. "It's not ergotism," he said flatly, stirring his espresso with more force than necessary. "The toxicology doesn't fit the transmission vector. The spread is non-contiguous. It's selective. It makes no biological sense." Anya listened patiently, her expression one of empathy, not surprise. "Perhaps you are looking for the wrong kind of toxin, doctor," she suggested gently. "You're a man of the 21st century. You can't imagine what it was like to live then. Strasbourg in 1518 was a pressure cooker. There had been famine. The plague was a recent memory. The church was promising damnation at every turn. People were terrified, starving, and utterly without hope. Despair is also a kind of poison." Julien scoffed, a raw, dismissive sound. "Despair is not a pathogen, Anja. It's an emotion. It doesn't have a mechanism of action. It can't be isolated in a lab. It can't explain this." His irritation was palpable. Her words, meant to be helpful, felt like an attack on the very foundations of his methodology. He was a man who measured the world in viruses and molecules. To be told the answer lay in something as nebulous as despair was to be told his entire life's work was inadequate. That night, fueled by caffeine and a stubborn refusal to be beaten, Julien was back in the archive, working under the low hum of the fluorescent lights. He was chasing down loose ends, rereading passages he de-skimmed before, searching for any physical clue he might have missed. He found a section near the back of the diary, written in a hand that was shakier than the rest, the ink slightly blurred as if by a trembling hand. It detailed a failed exorcism. The city council, in its desperation, had turned from medicine to the church. A respected priest, Father Michel, had been brought to the stage in the market square to perform the rite of exorcism on the dancers. Thomas, the diarist, had watched from the crowd, and he quoted the priest's subsequent report to the council with chilling accuracy. "I performed the full rite," the priest had stated, his voice heavy with defeat. "I spoke the words of power. I presented the holy relics." But there was no reaction. A true demon would have recoiled. It would have raged against the name of God. These people, they did not. The holy words simply passed through them, as if they were not there. Julien leaned closer, his heart pounding against his ribs. The next part was underlined twice by Thomas S. trembling pen. "The priest concluded," Thomas wrote, "that the dancers were not afflicted by a spiritual presence. There was no demon to cast out." He described their state as a profound hollowness, an emptiness of the spirit. It was not a possession, he claimed, but a spiritual absence. Julien stared at the words, a cold dread seeping into his bones. A spiritual absence, hollowness. The phrase echoed in the silent room. This was the moment his world cracked open. The phenomenon had failed a scientific test, the ergotism theory was in tatters, and now it had failed a superstitious one. It wasn't demonic possession, it wasn't biology, and it wasn't the supernatural as anyone understood it. It was something else. Something that fell in the terrifying chasm between the two. His simple thesis was dead. His neat, orderly scientific world had been shattered by a 500-year-old description of a failed exorcism. All his certainties were gone, leaving only the diary on the table and the terrifying, profound hollowness of the mystery itself. The silence in the archive was absolute, but for Julien Dubois, it was louder than a scream. The priestess' words, a spiritual absence, a hollowness, had detonated his entire framework. He had spent his career chasing tangible things, pathogens with names and structures, things that could be seen under a microscope. Now he was chasing a ghost, an absence. For a long moment, he sat staring at the diary, a man adrift. Then, a new kind of energy began to stir within him. The frustration and doubt didn't vanish, but they were forged into a sharp, intense resolve. If the answer wasn't in biology, he would have to learn a new language. The days that followed were a blur of intense, obsessive work. Julien's world shrank to his hotel room, the archives, and the digital universe on his laptop. He dove headfirst into a new field with the same rigor he had once applied to toxicology. His screen, once filled with molecular diagrams, now displayed articles on mass psychogenic illness, case studies on conversion disorders, and deep dives into the history of social hysterias. He devoured texts on sociology, on group psychology, on the power of cultural narratives to shape physical reality. He was a biologist learning to be a historian of the human mind. He was no longer working alone. Anya, sensing the shift in his approach, became his partner in the descent. Together, they burrowed deep into the city's memory, pulling dusty tax records from forgotten shelves and unspooling fragile scrolls of church tithings. The data they gathered was of a different kind now. It wasn't about biomarkers, it was about misery. They uncovered a grim, interlocking timeline of catastrophe. The parish records chronicled a spike in infant mortality. The tax receipts showed a populace crushed by poverty. The chronicles of the preceding years spoke of a brutal winter, a late frost, and a harvest that had utterly failed. They painted a portrait of Strasbourg in 1518 as a city on its knees, a tinderbox of despair waiting for a spark, and then they found the spark. In the records of the Strasbourg Cathedral, they found notes on a series of sermons delivered that summer by a visiting priest, a gaunt, fanatical man whose words were designed to stoke the embers of fear into a wildfire. As Julien read the transcriptions, the scene came to life with terrifying clarity. The cavernous nave of the cathedral is packed, the air thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and the fear of God. Light struggles through the high stained glass windows, illuminating a congregation of the poor and the desperate. In the crowd, her face thin and anxious, is Frau Anya Trofea. At the pulpit, the fanatical priest leans forward, his voice a thunderous echo in the stone chamber. He is not speaking of a gentle, forgiving God. He is speaking of Saint Vitus. You cry out from your hunger. The priest roars, his finger jabbing at the crowd. You lament your empty purses, but you do not lament the sickness in your souls. You have turned from God to vanity and sin, and Saint Vitus sees. He is not the saint of healing for the likes of you. He is the avenger of the impious. And his punishment is a dance from which you will not rest. He will seize your limbs and cast you into a frenzy, a dance of damnation that will lead your blackened souls straight to the pits of hell. The words washed over the terrified congregation, a promise of a very specific, very theatrical form of divine retribution. In the crowd, Frau Trofea trembled, the priest's sermon planting a seed of terror in her soul. Late one night in the archive, long after Anya had gone home, Julien found something tucked into a flap in the diary's back cover. It was a small collection of pages, folded over and sealed with a drop of wax. The writing inside was different. The formal, precise script of the physician's assistant dissolved into a pained, personal scrawl. It was a confession. I must write this, the entry began, for God to see if no man ever does. My master and all of this city knows me as Thomas, the physician's assistant, but I am also a brother. And my sister, my sweet Greta, was among the first to die. Julien read on, his breath held tight in his chest. Thomas confessed his deepest, most shameful thought. As he had watched his younger sister join the dancers, her body thrashing in the street, his first feeling was not terror, but a strange and overwhelming pity. Her life had been a short, brutal affair of endless toil and gnawing hunger. She was a beast of burden, old at 17. And as he watched her in the throes of the dance, her eyes wide with a manic, unseeing light, he saw something else. A fleeting, terrifying moment of ecstatic release. For the first time in her miserable life, she was free from the pain of her own existence. The dance was not a sickness that had befallen her. It was a desperate, fatal solution her own mind had invented to escape a reality that had become unbearable. The final mystery was revealed in the diary's last, most painful memory. It was the key that unlocked everything. The scene unfolds in Julien's mind, a flashback to the study of Meister Klaus Richter. The room is dark, panelled with wood, filled with the imposing authority of the master physician. Thomas, a young man twisted with grief and desperation, stands before him. Master Richter, Thomas pleads, his voice thin. It is not a fever of the blood. I have seen it. It chooses one in a house and leaves the rest. It is a thing of the spirit, a despair. Richter cuts him off, his voice dripping with condescending certainty. Feelings do not cause fevers, Thomas. The soul is the purview of priests. I am a man of science. I deal in the physical, in the humors, the blood, the bile. Find me a physical cause, or you are wasting my time. Our time. Thomas looks at the Master's stern, unyielding face. He sees the wall of dogma before him. and in a moment of terrible, desperate brilliance, he understands. To get this man to act, to do anything for his dying sister, he must speak the only language the master understands. He must give him a physical cause. Thomas takes a breath and lies, the lie that will echo for 500 years. "Her fingers," he says, his voice barely a whisper. "Before the dancing, she said her fingers tingled, and her limbs they felt cold and looked dark." Richter's eyes light up with the thrill of diagnosis. Tingling, discoloration. Classic signs of a humoral imbalance affecting the extremities. He nods, satisfied. He now has the evidence he needs. Thomas S.'s face, in Julien S.'s mind, is a mask of profound guilt. He had done it. He had gotten the great physician to pay attention. He had invented the symptoms of ergotism to save his sister from a disease of the soul, and in doing so, had inadvertently provided the false evidence for a catastrophic medical blunder. Julien slammed the diary shut. The sound echoed in the silent archive. It was all a lie. The entire ergotism theory, the scientific trail he had so confidently followed, was a ghost. A red herring planted 5 centuries ago by a desperate brother trying to save his sister from a world that had no cure for her true ailment. Despair. The slam of the diary shutting echoed the sound of a door closing on one reality and opening onto another. Julien now understood. The foundation of the accepted scientific theory wasn't evidence. It was a lie. A sad, desperate lie told by a grieving brother to a dogmatic master. Armed with this devastating knowledge, Julien felt a fire of conviction he hadn't felt before. He wasn't just solving a historical puzzle anymore. He was correcting a 500-year-old injustice, giving a voice to Thomas and his sister Greta. His first step was a video call to Dr. Alistair Finch, the editor of the world's most prestigious medical journal. Finch appeared on the screen, a man in his 50s with a sleek haircut and the placid, confident air of someone who sits at the very top of the institutional food chain. He listened patiently as Julien, with controlled passion, laid out the entire narrative. The failure of the ergotism theory, the socio-economic pressures, the cultural context of the St. Vitus sermons, and the final explosive revelation of Thomas's fabricated evidence. When Julien finished, Finch steepled his fingers, his expression unreadable. "Julien, it's a fascinating story. Truly, a wonderful piece of historical detective work." He paused. "But it's a story. Our readers, our subscribers, they expect hard science. They expect testable hypotheses. Mass psychogenic illness, it's nebulous. It's a diagnosis of exclusion. There's no pathogen. There's nothing to put under a microscope." Julien felt a familiar cold dread creeping up his spine. The evidence is in the historical record, in the transmission patterns. Finch cut him off with a placating smile. "The evidence is circumstantial. Look, I'll be blunt. Give me a molecule, and you're on the cover. Find a rare localized fungus, a unique neurotoxin in the water supply, something we can measure. But a story about despair. It belongs in a history journal, not here." The words were a perfect, chilling echo of Meister Klaus Richter's dismissal 5 centuries earlier. "Feelings do not cause fevers. Find me a physical cause." Julien was facing the same wall of dogma, just with a better suit and a faster internet connection. Dejected and exhausted, Julien walked back into the archives the next day to thank Anya and pack his things. The fight had gone out of him. The modern world, just like the ancient one, wanted a simple physical answer, and he didn't have one. Anya saw the defeat on his face. "Don't let them win, Julien," she said softly. "It's over, Anya. They want a villain they can see, a fungus, a poison. They don't want to hear that the villain might have been us." He was closing his research case when Anya stopped him. "One last look," she said, pushing the small leather diary across the table toward him. He sighed, but took it. It felt heavy in his hands, weighted with all its secrets. He opened it one last time, his fingers tracing the fragile pages. He flipped to the very end, past the final entry, and saw something he'd missed. Tucked into the back cover was a final loose page. On it was a charcoal sketch. It was the face of a young woman, Greta, drawn by her brother Thomas after her death. Julien had expected to see a face contorted in a manic grin, a mask of madness. But it wasn't. The face was peaceful, almost serene. Her eyes were closed. The lines of hardship on her young face seemed to have smoothed away in death, and on her cheek, etched with a single, deliberate charcoal line, was a tear. It wasn't a drawing of a victim of a plague. It was a portrait of a soul finally at rest, rendered with all of a brotheress love and grief. Julien stared at the sketch, and something inside him hardened into steel. Finch wanted a molecule. Richter wanted a physical cause. But the most powerful piece of data in this entire investigation was this drawing. A subjective, emotional, utterly human expression of truth. This was his proof, and he would make them listen. The lecture hall of the Historical Medical Society was packed. Julien stood at the podium, a single spotlight cutting through the darkness. He did not begin with charts or graphs. He began with a story. The story of a city gripped by fear and famine. He put up the maps of Strasbourg, showing the red pins that defied all logic of a foodborne pathogen. He put up the failed computer simulations, the cold, hard numbers that proved his own initial theory wrong. He then presented the records of crop failures, of crushing taxes. He read excerpts from the fanatical sermons on St. Vitus, letting the priest's terrifying words echo in the modern hall. Then, he did something extraordinary. He put his epidemiological software on the main screen, the same software he used to model viruses. But instead of a virus, he had programmed a new kind of pathogen, a single, powerful, terrifying idea. He modeled its spread based not on proximity to a food source, but on social connections, on line of sight, on exposure to the sermon. The simulation bloomed across the screen, a contagion of behavior, a cascade of despair that perfectly matched the random-seeming pattern of the red pins on the map. He was using the rigorous tools of modern science to prove a psychological diagnosis. It was a masterful, stunning synthesis of hard data and human narrative. He ended his presentation, and the floor was opened for questions. A hand immediately shot up, a skeptical doctor in the front row, a man with the same air of certainty as Alistair Finch. "Dr. Dubois, it's a compelling narrative," the man said, his tone edged with condescension. "But you've presented no physical proof, no blood work, no tissue samples, nothing but old stories and a fancy computer model. So, I ask you again, where is the proof?" Julien paused, letting the challenge hang in the air. He looked directly at the man. "The proof is in the outcome," he said, his voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the room. 400 people died. They died because the physicians of their time, men of science, suffered a catastrophic failure of imagination. They looked for a sickness of the body because they refused to acknowledge a sickness of the soul, a sickness born of despair. He took a breath, letting his final hard-won truth settle over the audience. The plague wasn't in their blood. It was in their world. The hall was utterly silent. No one moved. No one spoke. In the profound quiet, Julien Dubois knew he had finally been heard. What a story. When we first hear about the dancing plague, our modern minds immediately want a clean, scientific answer. A poison, a fungus, a neurological disorder. Something we can name and categorize. Dr. Dubois starts there, looking for a simple pathogen, a tangible enemy. And for a moment, it seems like he's found one in ergotism. Case closed. But the story's real power comes when that simple answer falls apart. We're left with something much more unsettling and maybe more profound. The final diagnosis, mass psychogenic illness, isn't really a thing you can find under a microscope. It's a scientific label for a social phenomenon. It's a name for what happens when a community's despair becomes so great that it physically manifests as a deadly contagion of behavior. This makes me wonder about the role of superstition. The people of Strasbourg in 1518 didn't have the language of psychology, but they had the language of curses. They believed St. Vitus was punishing them. Science would say they were wrong, but was the effect any different? The fear of the curse, born from famine and misery, was real enough to make them dance to their deaths. The story suggests that the true plague wasn't a fungus in their bread, but a powerful idea in their world. It took 500 years for our scientific tools to become sophisticated enough to model that. So here's my question for you. Which truth do you think matters more? The scientific label we can apply centuries later, or the powerful belief that shaped the terrifying reality for those who lived it? Let me know your thoughts in the comments.